The sun was setting over a quiet, rural stretch of farmland in Georgia, painting the horizon in hues of orange and purple. It was the kind of evening that seemed almost too peaceful to belong to a world filled with unrest. Henry Johnson stood at the edge of his field, wiping his hands on a well-worn cloth as he admired the rows of crops he had spent years nurturing. To anyone passing by, Henry looked like any other hard-working farmer, dressed in a plaid shirt and mud-stained jeans. But there was more to him than met the eye. Henry was a Marine, retired now, but not just any Marine. He was a Medal of Honor recipient, a man who had faced down unimaginable odds in the heat of combat and come out the other side. Though his medals and accolades were safely tucked away in a box in his modest farmhouse, he carried his military discipline and quiet strength with him every day. Farming was his sanctuary now, a way to reconnect with the earth after years of witnessing destruction. But even in this peaceful corner of the world, trouble had a way of finding him. It started with whispers at the local diner, murmurs about how a man like him shouldn't be owning so much land. Henry had ignored it at first. He was used to the stares, the muttered comments under breath, and the thinly veiled hostility that came with being a successful black man in a place where old prejudices still lingered. But the tension had been building for weeks, and tonight it would boil over in ways no one could have anticipated. As Henry walked back toward his farmhouse, the crunch of gravel under tires caught his attention. He turned to see a pickup truck pulling up to the edge of his property, its headlights cutting through the twilight. 4 men climbed out, their faces shadowed by the dim light. Henry recognized them immediately. They were locals who had made their disdain for him known in subtle, and sometimes not so subtle ways. "Evan and Henry," one of them drawled, his tone heavy with mock friendliness. It was Dale, the self-appointed leader of their little group. He was flanked by his usual crew, Chuck, a wiry man with a permanent scowl, Earl, whose bulk made him seem more intimidating than he probably was, and Jimmy, the youngest of the group, whose nervous energy betrayed his inexperience in whatever they were planning. Henry nodded, his expression calm but wary. "Evenin'," he replied, his voice steady. "What brings you out here?" Dale took a step closer, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his worn denim jacket. "Just thought we'd pay you a visit. You've been getting a little too comfortable out here, don't you think?" Henry's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. "I'm just minding my own business, same as always." Chuck let out a short, humorless laugh. "Might be time to start minding someone else's then." The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Henry glanced at the men, noting the way their shoulders tensed and their hands fidgeted. They weren't just here to talk. "You boys sure you want to do this?" Henry asked, his tone still calm but now laced with a quiet warning. He took a slow step forward, the fading sunlight catching the faint scars on his hands, silent reminders of battles fought long ago. Jimmy shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between Henry and Dale. "Maybe we should just go," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "Shut it, Jimmy," Dale snapped, his tone sharp enough to make the younger man flinch. "We came here for a reason." Henry sighed, his gaze steady as he locked eyes with Dale. "Whatever you're thinking, I'd suggest you think twice. Ain't nothing good gonna come from this." But Dale wasn't listening. He gestured to his crew, and they began to fan out, circling Henry like predators sizing up their prey. The farmer didn't move, didn't flinch. Instead, he stood his ground, his calm demeanor betraying nothing of the storm brewing inside him. Dale smirked, mistaking Henry's lack of reaction for fear. "What's the matter, Henry? You scared?" For a brief moment, Henry said nothing. Then slowly he unbuttoned the cuffs of his shirt and rolled up his sleeves, revealing the strong, sinewy arms of a man who had spent a lifetime working hard and fighting harder. He took a deep breath, his voice low but firm. "You boys have no idea what you're about to step into," he said, his words hanging in the air like a loaded weapon. The group hesitated for a split second, just long enough for a seed of doubt to creep into their minds. But before they could fully grasp the gravity of their mistake, Henry's gaze hardened, and his posture shifted ever so slightly, a subtle but unmistakable reminder of the Marine he once was. And that's when it hit them. This wasn't just a farmer standing before them. This was a man who had faced down death itself and lived to tell the tale. The sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the field into darkness. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, its echo fading into the night. And as the shadows swallowed the scene, one thing became clear. This wasn't going to end the way they thought it would. The silence that followed felt like an eternity. The 4 men stood frozen, caught between bravado and the unspoken unease that had settled over them. Henry didn't move, his steady gaze shifting between them, reading them like a seasoned chess player analyzing his opponent's next move. The air was thick with tension, heavy enough to make even the bravest heart falter. "Well?" Henry asked finally, his voice calm, but carrying an edge that sent a shiver down Jimmy's spine. "You got something to say, or are we just standing here all night?" Dale's smirk faltered for just a second, but he quickly masked it with a sneer. "You think you're tough, huh? Just 'cause you got a little land and play farmer doesn't mean you're better than us." Henry tilted his head slightly, his expression almost amused. "That's got nothing to do with it. But I do know one thing. You boys don't want this fight." The way he said it wasn't a threat. It was a statement, plain and simple, like he was reading a fact off a page. That calm confidence unnerved Dale more than he cared to admit, but he wasn't about to back down in front of his crew. He took a step closer, close enough now that Henry could smell the faint trace of cheap beer on his breath. "Listen here, old man," Dale growled. "You don't belong here. This town ain't for people like you, and it's about time someone reminded you of that." Henry let out a quiet sigh, one that carried more weariness than anger. He'd heard words like these before, too many times to count. They used to sting, used to make his blood boil. But after everything he'd been through, he'd learned to pick his battles. Tonight, though, it seemed like the battle had come to him. "You finished?" Henry asked, his voice as steady as ever. Earl, the biggest of the group, stepped forward now, his heavy boots crunching against the dirt. "We're not leaving till you get the message," he said, crossing his arms over his chest. Henry looked up at the man, his gaze unwavering. He didn't need to puff up his chest or raise his voice to make his presence known. It was in the way he stood, the way he carried himself, like a man who had seen the worst the world had to offer and come out the other side stronger. "You ever stop to think about what you're really doing here?" Henry asked, his tone conversational, almost casual. "You're trespassing on my property, trying to intimidate me. For what? What's it gonna get you?" Chuck let out a sharp laugh, the sound grating against the stillness of the night. "Don't act like you're some kind of saint," he said. "You're just a man who got lucky. That medal don't mean nothing out here." At the mention of his Medal of Honor, Henry's jaw tightened ever so slightly. He didn't wear his service on his sleeve, didn't flaunt his achievements, but hearing it dismissed so casually stirred something deep within him. He took a step closer to Chuck, his movements slow and deliberate. "That medal," Henry said quietly, his voice like a steel blade sheathed in velvet, "ain't about luck. It's about sacrifice. About people I'd fought alongside who didn't make it home. So don't you dare stand there and act like you understand what it means." The weight of his words hung heavy in the air, and for a moment, even Chuck seemed at a loss for what to say. But Dale wasn't done. He wasn't about to let Henry take control of the situation. "Not here, not now. You think you're better than us just 'cause you wore a uniform." Dale snapped, his voice rising. "You think that makes you untouchable?" Henry shook his head slowly, a hint of sadness flickering in his eyes. "I don't think I'm better than anybody," he said. "But I do know I've faced down men a lot tougher than you. And still here." Jimmy shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to the truck parked behind them. "Maybe we should just leave," he muttered again, his voice barely above a whisper. "Shut up, Jimmy," Dale barked, his frustration boiling over. "You don't get it, do you? This ain't about him. It's about showing this whole town who's in charge." Henry took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping over the men before him. He didn't see enemies. He saw fear, insecurity, and desperation disguised as bravado. He saw men who were clinging to outdated notions of power and control, trying to hold on to something that had never really been theirs to begin with. "You're scared," Henry said finally, his tone soft but firm. "Not of me, of change, of losing what you think makes you important." Dale's face flushed red with anger, and he took another step forward, his fists clenched. "You don't know a damn thing about me," he shouted. Henry didn't flinch, didn't back down. Instead, he met Dale's anger with a quiet strength that only seemed to infuriate him more. "I know you're better than this," Henry said. "All of you are. But you've got to decide if you want to be the kind of men who tear others down or the kind who build something worth being proud of." For a moment, the words seemed to hang in the air, sinking into the cracks of doubt that had begun to form in the group's resolve. But just as quickly, Dale shook his head, his expression hardening. "You think you're some kind of preacher now," he spat. "Save your speeches for someone who cares." Henry sighed, the weight of the moment pressing heavy on his shoulders. He didn't want this fight. He never did. But he also knew that sometimes standing your ground wasn't just about defending yourself. It was about sending a message. The sound of the wind rustling through the trees filled the silence that followed, a stark contrast to the storm brewing between them. Henry glanced at the horizon, where the last traces of daylight had all but disappeared. The darkness was settling in now, and with it came the realization that this confrontation was far from over. "Last chance," Henry said quietly, his voice carrying a quiet authority that stopped the men in their tracks. "Walk away. Go home. You don't want what's coming if you stay." But as the men exchanged uncertain glances, it became clear that pride and stubbornness were winning out over reason. Dale took another step forward, a cruel smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "We'll see about that," he said. And with that, the night seemed to hold its breath, the tension crackling like electricity in the air. Whatever was about to happen, one thing was certain. It would leave a mark on all of them, one way or another. The moment Dale's words hung in the air, Henry knew there was no turning back. The line had been crossed, and now it was only a matter of what would happen next. He shifted his weight slightly, his boots digging into the dirt beneath him. Every instinct in his body told him to be ready, not just physically but mentally, for what these men might do and what he might have to do in return. Dale, sensing that he still had control over his group, glanced back at his crew as if to rally them. Earl cracked his knuckles, trying to project an intimidating presence, while Chuck adjusted his grip on the crowbar he'd been holding loosely at his side. Jimmy, though, lingered toward the back, his hands stuffed in his jacket pockets, head down like he wished he were anywhere else. "Don't stand there like a statue, old man," Dale said, his voice dripping with mockery. "You wanted to talk about who's scared. Let's see how tough you are when the numbers aren't in your favor." Henry's eyes narrowed slightly, but his expression remained calm. He didn't rise to the taunts. He didn't need to. The years had taught him that reacting impulsively only gave the other person control. Instead, he spoke in a voice so steady it made Dale's bravado falter for just a second. "You don't want to do this," Henry said, his words not a plea but a simple fact. "Whatever you think you're proving, it's not worth it." The hesitation in Dale's stance was almost imperceptible, but Henry caught it. Dale wasn't as confident as he wanted everyone to believe. He was playing a role, one fueled by ego and the need to impress the others. But Dale's pride wouldn't let him back down now, not with his crew watching. Without warning, Dale lunged forward, shoving Henry hard in the chest. Henry barely moved, his solid frame absorbing the impact like a stone wall. Dale took a step back, surprised by how little his action had affected the man. For a split second, he looked uncertain. "You done?" Henry asked quietly, his tone calm but firm. Earl took that moment to step in, his broad shoulders casting a shadow over Henry. "You're outnumbered, old man," Earl said, his deep voice rumbling. "Might be time for you to shut your mouth and listen." Henry tilted his head, his expression unreadable. He wasn't intimidated by Earl's size or his posturing. If anything, he saw the fear hidden behind the man's bravado. The way his eyes darted to Dale for reassurance. The way his hands clenched and unclenched as if he didn't quite know what to do with them. "You boys think numbers make you strong," Henry said, his voice carrying a quiet intensity. "But strength isn't about how many people you've got on your side. It's about knowing who you are and standing firm, no matter what." Chuck let out a derisive laugh, stepping forward to join the standoff. "You talk too much," he sneered, gripping the crowbar tightly. "Maybe we ought to teach you some respect." As Chuck raised the crowbar, Henry's eyes flicked to the movement, his body instinctively tensing. But before anything could happen, a loud, sharp bark pierced the night. Everyone froze, their heads turning toward the sound. From the shadows near the barn, a large German shepherd emerged, its ears perked and teeth bared. The dog's growl was low and menacing, a clear warning to anyone who dared to take another step. Henry didn't even glance at the dog. He didn't need to. The connection between them was unspoken, built on trust and years of loyalty. "That's Duke," Henry said simply, his voice cutting through the tension. "And he doesn't take kindly to folks who don't belong here." The sight of the dog seemed to shake Jimmy the most. He took a step back, his hand twitching nervously at his side. "Maybe we should go," he muttered, glancing at Dale. "This ain't worth it, man." But Dale wasn't ready to back down. His pride wouldn't let him. "It's just a dog," he snapped, his tone more defensive than confident. "Ain't nobody scared of a mutt." Henry's gaze hardened ever so slightly. "You should be," he said quietly. For a moment, it seemed like the dog's presence might de-escalate the situation. But then Dale, in a reckless display of defiance, picked up a rock from the ground and hurled it in Duke's direction. The rock missed, landing harmlessly in the dirt, but the action made the dog's growl deepen. its muscles tensing as it prepared to act. "Dale, stop," Jimmy said, his voice rising with panic. "You're gonna make this worse." But Dale wasn't listening. He was too caught up in his own anger, too blinded by the need to prove himself. "Come on then," he shouted, his voice echoing into the night. Henry's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. He took a deliberate step forward, placing himself between Dale and the dog. His voice was calm, but carried a weight that made even Earl pause. "That's enough," Henry said. "You're not gonna win this, and you know it. Walk away while you still can." The standoff lingered for a few agonizing seconds, the air thick with tension. Dale's grip on the situation was slipping, and he knew it. But before he could make another move, a voice called out from the distance, breaking through the silence like a clap of thunder. "What's going on here?" All eyes turned toward the source of the voice, where the faint beam of a flashlight cut through the darkness. A figure emerged, moving steadily toward them. It was Sheriff Carter, his badge glinting faintly in the moonlight. His presence was enough to make Chuck and Earl step back, their bravado faltering. Dale's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. "We were just leaving, Sheriff," he said, his tone laced with resentment. The sheriff stopped a few feet away, his sharp eyes taking in the scene. He glanced at Henry, then at the group of men, his expression unreadable. "That's so," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Because it looks to me like you boys are somewhere you don't belong." Henry stayed quiet, letting the sheriff handle the situation. Dale hesitated, his gaze flicking between Henry, the sheriff, and his crew. Finally, he let out a frustrated grunt and turned toward the truck. "Come on," he muttered to the others. "Let's go." One by one, they followed him, their footsteps heavy against the gravel. Jimmy lingered for a moment, glancing back at Henry with an expression that was equal parts regret and fear, but he didn't say anything. He just climbed into the truck, and a moment later, they were gone, their taillights disappearing into the night. Sheriff Carter turned to Henry, his brow furrowed. "You all right?" he asked. Henry nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on the empty road. "Yeah," he said quietly, "I'm all right." But as the sheriff's flashlight beam swept over the ground, revealing the tension still etched into the dirt, Henry knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot.